So I don't have as detailed a outline as perhaps I should. So I'll just be kind of winging it. But our goal today is textures, understanding what they are, how they work, how to do them, and why they are so wonderful. So textures are a way to add surface detail to an object. You can use it to add images to an object, image textures. You can use them to add surface detail, bump mapping. You can use them to add dirt and scratches and grunge. You can actually apply them to brushes when you sculpt and give your brushes that detail. There's all sorts of different ways that you can use textures. So let's start with, we'll just start with a plane. I'll hit Shift A, add in a plane, make sure I'm in cycles, because that's what we're working in. And I'm going to add a new material, and I'm going to split my view so I can see my node editor. Okay. So I've got my material output, and I have my diffuse shader. And I'll change the color to blue. And I'll change my viewport color to, and I'll just leave that. That doesn't matter. And if I change my 3D view to rendered, I can see that I do, in fact, as I had hoped, have a blue plane. I'm also going to add a sun lamp just for some lighting. Shift A, add lamp, sun. Go into side view, move it up, and rotate it to about like that. And then in top view, I'll rotate it about like that. Okay. Now select my plane again and go back into rendered view. So now my plane has a little bit of light on it. So textures. Let's add, just to first see the power of them, I'm going to hit Shift A, add a texture node. I've got a bunch of different options. Brick, checker, magic, gradient, Musgrave, Voronoi, wave, noise, sky, environment, and image. Now, environment and image are both image-based texture nodes. Image is what you'll be using a majority of the time. The rest are procedurally generated textures. So if I start with a checker texture, I add that, and I'm going to connect the color of the checker output to the color of the diffuse input. And now I have a checker pattern on my plane. The plane is still one face, but it looks like it's got a bunch of faces. And my checker texture, I've got options. I can change the colors of each of the checks. I can change the scale. Okay, and that, in the most basic way, is a texture. Okay, that's a checker texture. There's, I encourage you to play around with all of these. There's a noise texture, which by default is all of the colors. If you hit Shift A and add a converter node and math, or I'm sorry, not math, RGB to BW, which is RGB to black and white, and place it on top there. Now you've got black and white clouds or noise. For those of you who use Photoshop a lot and use clouds to kind of help add variation, works the same way in Blender. You can adjust the scale, you can adjust the detail, distortion if you so choose, so it's now a little bit more swirly. There's your noise texture. I can add, let's look at the brick texture as well. So brick, I got a bunch more options here, but by default, that's what I get. It's not the most realistic looking brick, but depending on the style of your scene, it can be a good way to go. Got offsets, so how far off are the bricks set from each other, frequency of the offset, squash, which does that. I don't know exactly what squash does, but you can play around with it and kind of see how that works. And again, this is a procedurally generated texture, so I don't have to do any UV unwrapping to apply this texture. It just kind of automatically does it. In my 3D view, I can add in a UV sphere and give it the same texture, and you can see how that applies it. Let me delete this plane for a second. Now, so this is the way that it adds the texture by default. There are other ways that you can tell the texture to be applied to the object. And the way that you do that with the most control is something called UV mapping. Now, so let's talk about UVs. I'm going to let's add in a let's see. Let's add in a cube and a UV sphere. And I'll move the UV sphere over so that I can see both of them. And I will turn on my screencast keys for those of you in the room. Okay. Now, I am going to collapse, or I'm just going to shrink this top view because I don't need it right now. And I'm going to expand out and open up my UV image editor. Previously, we've used the UV image editor just to load in reference images, but it's also how we manipulate UVs. You can think of UVs as a 2D representation of a 3D object, okay? And it's called unwrapping or wrapping or mapping. When you unwrap an object, it's like the opposite of wrapping a Christmas present, where you put a two-dimensional sheet of paper around it in 3Ds. It's kind of the same process. So if I take this cube, and the key to unwrap is U. So I hit U, and I've got my UV mapping menu that pops up. I've got unwrap, smart UV project, and a bunch of other options. I can do cube projection and cylinder projection, project from view. Let's just worry about unwrapping for now. So I hit unwrap, and this is what I get. And it looks like I just have a square. And if I select one of the vertices and hit G to move it, I can see that there's another point underneath it. Okay, so all the points are there. They're just on top of each other. And you can kind of see how that's laid out. It's not the best way for adding a texture to it, because everything's on top of each other, so all the faces are going to end up looking the same. And you don't always want that. So let me select this UV sphere, and I'll hit U and unwrap that by default, and this is what I get. Clearly that does not look anything like a sphere or a circle or anything you would expect. So how do you make it do what you want? You need to add something called seams. Okay, much like in clothing, when you're working with fabric, you need to add seams to tell it how to lay flat. So if I just, with this sphere, I'm going to select just one edge loop that runs vertically along the whole thing. And I will hit Control E to bring up my edge menu and choose Mark Seam. And now if I deselect it, you can see that this edge is red. It tells me that there is a seam there. Now I'm going to select everything and hit U and unwrap. And now this is what I get. And close that and expand this out. Still not quite there, but you can kind of start to see how this works. Okay. So let me go back over to my cube, and let's unwrap this properly. How many of you in grade school had printed out a piece of paper and then cut it and folded it up to make a paper cube? You ever remember doing that, or am I okay? A couple of you. Good. So this isn't completely out of the blue. We're going to do that in reverse. we need to add the seams so that this can lay flat. So I'm going to first choose what my kind of front face is, and for that I'll just choose this one that is actually facing front, this one right here. And I'm going to go into edge select mode, and I'm just going to start selecting the seams that I want. So I will choose these. Now the reason why I'm doing this in edge select mode is because if I want these 3 edges to be marked as a seam, and I do it in vertex select mode, I can't just select these 3 edges. It automatically selects this 4th edge as well, which I don't want. So if I go into edge select mode, I can deselect that edge and only choose the ones that I want. Okay, so I'll mark these 3 edges on the top first. And I will hit Control E and mark seam. Then I'll select everything and hit U. Mark seam. Control E, mark seam. I'll select everything at U and unwrap. And this is my result. Getting there. So we're getting there. Let's finish adding some seams. And the next one that I want to add, let me think about this. I want that to fold out like that. I want a seam here, here, and then the same on the other side. Control E, mark seam. Select everything U, and unwrap. Okay, that is the shape that I was looking for. So, select everything. You notice if you deselect everything, the UVs disappear on the left. Just keep that in mind. So I've got my seams marked, and now I've got this layout. I've got all 6 faces of the cube laid out flat. All right, so I have my cube unwrapped. What do I do now? Well, it depends on exactly how I want to texture this. And let's say I just want to add an image to all the sides. What I can do is in my UV image editor, I can click Image, Open Image, and then I will navigate to an image that I want to add to it. In this case, I've got one on my desktop in my textures, and I will choose the brick texture. And I'll open that up, and now I've got bricks right here. Okay, we're back. Now I stopped recording for a while, so I forgot where I was. I've loaded in this image texture now that I have my cube unwrapped. One note as well, if you end up marking a seam that you don't want, you can hit Control E and clear the seam. So if you accidentally do too much, that's how you get it back. Okay, so with everything selected, I can look at my UVs. I've loaded my brick texture, and now I've got UVs. If I go to rendered view, I don't see anything yet, and that's because I need to set up the material now. So I've got my cube selected, and I'm going to add a new material. So now we need to set up our material so that we can actually see our texture. And the way that we do that, we've got our diffuse right here. We can hit Shift A and add in a texture, image texture, and choose. Because I loaded the image texture here in the image editor, it's already loaded into Blender's buffer, so I can just click on this icon next to the open button. Otherwise, you can just click open and navigate to wherever your textures are. And I will choose. As in the file browser in Blender, if you want to see the thumbnail view of the images, you can click on this button right up here. It's the 3rd button after create new directory, and you can see all of your thumbnails. Choose that and open the image. And here we go. So I've got my image loaded into my image texture. Now connect the color to the color. And now I have bricks on my cube. Just like that. Okay. All right, so this is just adding a image texture to a diffuse shader. This isn't dealing with specularity or bump mapping or translucency or anything like that. This is really just affecting color. If you look here, I'm actually going to split my view one more time. Go to 3D view here and zoom in. Okay. So I've got my cube selected in edit mode with all the vertices. This way, give me just a second. Okay. This way I can still edit the UVs. Now watch down here. I don't know how many of you can see that. Let me move the window. Let's change this to properties, and we'll change this. Actually, oops, I'm just splitting more and more. Hold on. There we go. Just the 3D view. Okay. So I've got a cube here. Now watch the texture as I move these UVs around. Okay. So by moving the UVs around, I can choose exactly how this texture is mapped to the object. I can rotate this, and it's going to rotate on the cube. I can scale it. If I scale it down, the bricks get larger. If I scale it up, the bricks get smaller. Now, I can scale past the bounds of this image, and this image happens to be a tileable texture. It will tile seamlessly, so I can scale to my heart's content. Not all textures are tileable by default. If it's not tileable, then you will see seams once it starts replicating itself across the image. Question came up, how do you know where to add seams? Well, on a cube, it's fairly simple. On a sphere, it's also fairly simple. General guidelines is you want to add seams where you're not going to see them. Okay, so if it's on a character, it might be under the arms, on the inside of the legs. If it's on a hard surface, if there's any creases, if there's a side that's never going to be visible to camera, that's a good place to add seams. For characters, it's oftentimes you'll add it down the top and the back of the head because that's where that'll be covered with hair. Any really hard edges or changes or edges where there's a change in material, it's another place where you can hide seams. And this is just one way of adding a texture. You can actually do texture painting as well, which is fairly common, and then you can just paint the seams over and it'll blend together seamlessly. We may get into that in this class, we may not, depends on how we're doing on time. But just things to keep in mind as we're working with textures and UVs. Okay, so I added my image texture to my cube, and now I have a block of brick. Let's do the same thing to my UV sphere. So I'm going to select my sphere, tab to go into edit mode. I've got my edge that I added previously. That's not exactly how I want to unwrap this. So I'm going to select that edge again, hit Control E, and clear the seam. The way that I'm going to unwrap this is I'm going to select, actually, to demonstrate something first, I'm just going to add a seam around the center, mark the seam, select everything, and unwrap it. Okay. So now I've got, in my UV editor, I've got two halves of the sphere. Now, I don't see anything in my 3D view yet, and that's because I haven't given it a texture. So I am going to click New, and I've got my diffuse and my material output. So once again, I will hit Shift A, add a image texture, link the color to the color, and choose my brick texture. Okay. Now I've got brick on my sphere. And if you notice, right along the equator, which is where I marked the seam, you can see the seam in the texture. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about when I talk about seeing the seams in the texture. All right, so this is an illustration of what a texture seam looks like. Even though this is a tileable texture, the tileable edges of this texture are not what are lining up with the edges of my UV map. So I will select that edge and clear that seam. And then the way that I'm going to unwrap this is I'm going to select this edge loop up at the top here, and the similar one on the underside. Oops, not that. No, I'll zoom in. That. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong button, that's why. That one. And I will mark those seams. So I've got one on the top. Oh, now I have one on the top and the bottom. And then I'm going to go around to the back side of the sphere that I'm not going to see on camera, and I will select this edge loop here. Or, well, this edge, not the whole loop. Okay. Okay, so I've got this edge selected between the two seams that I already marked, and I will mark that seam. Okay, so you can see these are the seams that I have marked for my sphere. I'll select everything and hit U and unwrap. Okay. And this is how the sphere unwraps. It's a little bit distorted, and actually if I, in my UV image editor, if I hit N to bring up my properties and scroll down a bit, where is it? Somewhere here. Oh, I think I need to unwrap it again, maybe. Should give me... Okay, I'm going to hit X in the UV image editor and clear out my brick texture for a second. And actually, you know what? That won't work. Well, okay, I'll clear it out, and then if I select everything and hit N, I can check this stretch box. Okay, and what this will do is if any of these faces are really stretched out, it will display a different color. So if I move this over here, you can see the more stretched out it gets, the more it changes color. And what that'll tell me is, as I'm doing the mapping here, it'll tell me if something is going to get really distorted, which you can see that's what's happening right here, is these UVs are really distorted. So if you, one of the keys to good texturing is making sure that your UV maps are even. And this is a tool that you can use to make sure that they're even. Okay, and then again, that's in your UV image editor, you hit N to bring up the properties, and in the display section, it's the stretch box. You can check and uncheck. Okay. So I've got this unwrapped, and I'm going to bring up my brick texture again. Let's unwrap that one more time. Okay. I'll bring my camera back around and hide that. Another thing that we'll start to talk about is kind of packing your UVs so that you get the most what's called texel density out of your images. So your texture maps have a finite size that they can be, and it doesn't matter how big your environments are in the scene. You can only have an image so large as an image texture before the processing times just become unworkable. So usually that'll be between 1024 to 4096, so 1K to 4K. More is obviously better, but you want to try to pack in as much information into those finite amount of pixels as possible. So one of the things that you'll start doing is taking your UV, what are called islands, or the sections of the UV map, and moving them around and trying to pack them into your texture in a way that allows you to make them as large as possible. So select those, and then I can select everything and kind of scale it up just to give me the most detail that I can get out of this map. Okay. And when we start worrying about a little bit more complicated texturing next week, I'll go into more detail about, you know, getting the most out of the limited textures that you have. I just want you to start, you know, thinking about it and being aware of it now. Okay. So that is the real basics of adding image textures to your objects. But this is just adding a color map, basically, just a diffuse map to your objects to make it look like something. We can use textures, though, to add more detail. We can use textures, what are called spec maps or specular maps, that can be used to define what parts of your object are reflective, are shiny or glossy, and which parts are more diffuse or more of a matte finish. We can also use textures to what are called bump maps or normal maps. They're two slightly different things, but they have the same effect. And what they do is they can add texture and the illusion of depth to a surface. They don't actually add depth, but they make it look like it because it affects the way that light bounces off the object. So let's do that now. First, I'm going to open a new scene. And I will turn on my screencast keys. Okay, so brand new scene, and I'm going to delete the default cube and add in a plane instead. Okay, then I'm going to delete the default lamp and add in a sun lamp instead. And again, I will rotate it around a little bit like that, and I will rotate it around like that. So it's kind of pointed at the camera. Okay. And then I'm going to select my camera, hit N to, actually before I do that, I'm going to select my camera, and if I hit G and double tap Z, that will move the camera along the camera's Z direction, which for this is basically like zoom or dollying the camera in to get closer. And then to fine tune, I will go to my display, or not display, I'm sorry. It's view, lock camera to view, and just move the camera around just a little bit and get a view of the plane, something like this. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna undo the lock camera to view. All right, so I've got my camera oriented, I've got my light where I want it, I've got my plane, which is what I'm gonna texture. I'm gonna change my render engine back to cycles because my scene by default was not set to cycles. I'm going to expand up my timeline, and I'm going to change that to my 3D view, and my top I'm going to change to my node editor. Okay. And on the bottom I will go into my camera view, and I will hit Shift Z to go into rendered view. Okay. Actually, before I go into rendered view, I've got my plane here. And I'm going to apply 3 image textures to this plane. I'm going to apply the normal brick texture, diffuse map. I'm going to apply a specular map to the plane, and I'm going to apply a bump map. But before I do any of that, I have to unwrap the plane. Now, that might seem a little weird because the plane is just already flat, but you still need to tell Blender where the verts are and how you want them unwrapped. So I'm going to split my lower view right up here, and I'm going to move the right one to my UV image editor just so I can see it. And then in my 3D view, I'm going to go into top view, make sure I'm in, hit 5 to go into orthographic, and then tab to go into edit mode. Everything should be selected by default. And then I'll hit U, unwrap, and I'm just going to project from view bounds. Okay, if I just hit project from view, it doesn't quite fill up the texture space. If I hit U and project from view bounds, it'll fill up the whole texture space, so that when I add an image texture in a minute, it'll fill up the whole thing, and when I need it to tile, it will tile seamlessly. Okay, now you can project unwrap anything from the view. You'll have mixed results depending on how complicated the geometry is. With a plane, this is absolutely the fastest way to do it, is just select it, U, project from view bounds. Okay, so now I've got it unwrapped, and I just opened up my image editor so you could see that. I'm going to go ahead and collapse that back. I don't need it anymore. And I'll go back into object mode and the camera view. Okay, so now I need to give this plane a material that I can then apply textures to. You can't apply textures to an object unless it has a material first. So I'll go to my material settings, click new, and now I have nodes to work with. This is a good thing. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is just give it its diffuse color. So much like we did with the cube and the sphere, I'm going to hit Shift A, texture, image texture. I'm going to add that to the left of the diffuse. With the node editor, it can get complicated quickly, so I really encourage you to be careful about where you place your nodes and make sure you have an even, organized flow to it. If you just start placing them wherever, it's going to get really complicated and really tough to follow, especially if you close the file and don't come back to it for a week or two. So work neat, work organized. As with everything, it just makes things easier. Okay, so I've got my image texture here. I'm going to open up, I'm going to navigate to my textures folder, which is on my desktop, textures, and I'm going to choose this brick paver underscore DIFF for diffuse. I'm going to choose that texture, open the image, and connect it to my diffuse shader here. Now if I go to my 3D view and hit Shift Z, I can see that yes, in fact, I do have the texture applied. This is a good thing. Now, so this plane right now has a diffuse shader applied to it, which means there'll be no specular reflection, no specular highlight. And I want it to have some of that as well. So in my node editor, I'm going to hit Shift A, add in a shader, glossy. Okay. So now I've got a glossy shader and I have a diffuse shader. If I put the glossy shader into my material output, it kicks my diffuse shader out. And I don't want that. I want them both. So what I need to do is add in a mix shader. So Shift A, shader, mix shader. And then I can plug in my diffuse and my glossy. And put my mix shader back into the surface. Okay. I'll switch that for now. Now, if on my mix shader, I can adjust my factor value. If I go all the way to 0, it's the top input, which is my glossy. If I go all the way to 1, it's my diffuse shader, the bottom one. I'll leave it at 0.5 for now. Okay. Now I'm going to add in, I don't want everything to be glossy, because right now when everything is glossy, it looks like this, which is terrible and not what a paved or a paved sidewalk looks like. So I'm going to add in another image texture, and I will open up my brick paver underscore spec. Open that image. Now you might be tempted to put the spec into my glossy color. That's what happens if you do that, because the specular texture is a black and white texture. The way that you use this is Blender will interpret this grayscale image as just the number as values, black being 0, white being 255. Okay, so it's just a grayscale range. And you can use that as values to kind of drive other things. So if I put my image texture, my spec texture into the roughness, now you can see something interesting start to happen. Okay, the areas on my texture that are dark are receiving, let's see, they are receiving a lot of specularity. The ones that are white are receiving none. So I need to switch this around, I believe. No, I lied. I think it's just bumping everything up too much. So I'll come back to that in a second. The other thing you notice is that we don't really have any color left in our bricks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my diffuse image and I'm going to add the color into my glossy shader as well. Okay, so both my diffuse and glossy, get rid of the spec texture for a second, both my diffuse and glossy are getting the color. Okay, so if I go all the way to 0, that's my glossy. If I go all the way to 1, that's my diffuse. Go back to 0.5. Okay. Now, my spec texture, I'm going to bring the color into, bring it into roughness. And whenever you're using an image texture that you don't actually want the color from, it's a good idea to add in a converter RGB to black and white, just to make sure that it is converting the color data just to the value. Okay, so color to value, and now we've got gray into gray. The next thing that I'm going to do is, because this is a little too intense, and right now I don't have a whole lot of control over that, I can add in, let's try a color ramp, converter, color ramp, and I need to spread out my nodes a bit. Actually, I'm going to hit Shift Space to maximize this for a second. I can move things around. Okay. So I've got my glossy and diffuse shader being mixed and going to my output. I've got my diffuse image texture, my specular image texture, and then I've just added this color ramp. So let's look at this color ramp and how I can use it to affect my output. If I bring my black and white in, you can kind of see how the grayscale is affecting specularity. And, you know, that's not really doing what I want it to do. That's what I get for trying new things. I will delete that, and I'm just going to, instead, I'll add a converter math node. And I'll hook that back up into the roughness. Now, the math node, by default, it's add. If I click multiply, I've got my image texture going into the first value, the second value. I can type in any number that I want, and it will multiply that by the number. So if I just type in 1, I'm getting the full value of that image texture, driving the roughness. If I bring that value to 0, I'm not getting any of that, and I'm only getting the diffuse. Okay, so if I go to something like, let's try 0.2, yeah, that's still too much. So I'll go, let's say like 0.05 maybe. Nope, that's probably the wrong way. The thing about textures is there is no hard and fast rule for how they work. There's guidelines and there's commonalities, but as far as exactly how everything sets up and works, there's no hard and fast rule of, you know, you're always going to set up a brick texture this way. And I am admittedly not the strongest in texturing, but I can show you what to do and how to get close. With that in mind, I'm going to, instead of plugging my spec map into the glossy roughness, I'm going to move it over to this mix shader, plug it into the factor. Oops, not 2, 0.2. Let's see if we can get a better result here. As I adjust my glossy value, you can kind of see how it's affecting the bricks. Bring that back to 1. Let's see. Yeah, I think we'll not, for now, we'll go with this. So to review the values, I've got my glossy roughness set to 0.1. I've got my spec image texture going through my RGB to black and white. That's passing through my multiply, which is currently set to 1, so the multiply is not doing anything at the moment. And then that is going into my factor of my mix shader. And what that's doing is by putting my spec map into the factor, that is what is governing how the glossy and the diffuse nodes are being mixed. So instead of it just being a flat, half and half, some areas are getting the gloss and some of them are getting all the diffuse based on this image texture right here. Let's go ahead and add the third image texture now. So Shift A, add texture, image texture. I'm going to put this down below my diffuse, expand that out so you can see it, and then I will open up my bump map. Open image. Okay. Once again, I'm just going to go up here to my RGB to black and white and my multiply. I'm going to hold down Shift and select them both, and then hit Shift D to duplicate them, much like I would in the 3D view. And then I'm going to link the colors together. And then I'm going to take the output from my multiply and go into my displacement. And by default, that is way too much displacement. So I'm going to change the value of my multiply down to something like 0.2. That's still too much. Let's go 0.05. 0.02. Okay, so now you can see what the bump map is doing. Okay, and potentially what the power of it is. Now this is the part, my node tree is set up pretty close to the way that I want it. Now is the part where you spend a lot of time just tweaking things and figuring out the best way and the way that things look the best. So what I might do, I'm going to adjust my glossy roughness value. I'm going to bump that up to, let's go like 0.25. And let's see, maybe change the value on my spec map to 0.5, something like that. Now if I rotate around in my 3D view, you can kind of see what we're getting. Go back to there. Okay, so that is very roughly how you set up some textures, a diffuse, a spec, and a bump map to get some extra detail on your models. So before, when I was saying with some of your modeling projects, you've got some high frequency, small detail, you don't have to model it. You can use a bump map to get that detail without having to actually model it. Now, the way a bump map works is it just affects the way that the light interacts with the material. It doesn't actually change the geometry. It doesn't change the mesh. And you can see that if I zoom in here and look at just the edge of my plane, it's still a solid straight line. It's not actually, deforming the edge. You can actually use a displacement modifier. If I go into the modifiers, add modifier and displace, and I can choose a texture and go from there. The issue with that is that when you use a displacement modifier, you actually need to have a fairly dense mesh to get any reasonable detail. Okay, so if I take away my displacement modifier here, or I'm sorry, my bump map in the node editor, and then let's add in, we got my bump texture, which is image texture 2. Let's add a new texture. And actually, I gotta remember how to do this. I did it once, and then I forgot. I don't think I saved it. let me see. So I've got my displace texture, go to my modifier, and right away it doesn't do anything. And that's because it's just one face. I need to add a bunch more faces, like a whole lot. So I'm going to hit W and subdivide. Then I'm going to hit F6. Then I'm going to change the number of cuts from 1 to 30. And now you can start to see that the displace modifier is doing something. It's doing a lot of something. So I'm going to turn the strength way down to like 0.1. Okay. I still don't have enough mesh detail here. So I'm going to go back into edit mode, and I am going to subdivide it. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a subsurf modifier at level 3, and I will go and apply that. Okay. So now, this is how dense my mesh is. It's a bunch of really tiny faces. Go back into object mode. And now I can adjust my strength. And now it's starting to actually do something that's useful. If I hit N or hit T and shade it smooth. Okay. Now you can see what a true displacement map will do. And the displacement modifier is it actually moves the mesh around to get the look that I want. So if I go back into my rendered view, it's a bit dark right now, so I'm going to choose my sun and bump up the strength to 5 maybe. Let's go 10. Okay. Oh, that might actually have been too much. Take that back. 2. Okay. So now you can see, and if I zoom in here on the corners or on the edges, you can see that it does actually distort the edges. It's a very cool thing, and if you're doing a really close-up view of something and you want that high frequency detail, this is a great option. For larger scenes, like for our street scene, this would be ridiculous. But something to keep in mind as an option. So our goal is this street scene, and if here's the node tree, which looks very similar to what we just did. So let me load up a new or kind of a fresh street scene, and then we will get down to it. All right, and open, and desktop. So open up your street scenes. And, okay, so this is where I'm starting from. Yours should look more or less similar. And, all right, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to kind of set up my interface for working, which in this case is really just splitting my view from the top down and changing the top to my node editor. I'm already in cycles, so I don't have to worry about that. And then I'm going to select my sidewalk object. And my sidewalk already has a material applied to it, but it's really just a placeholder material, so I can see the difference. Now, we want to apply some image textures to it, so the first thing that we have to do is unwrap it. I'm going to select my sidewalk, I'm going to hit number pad / to go into local view, and then I'm going to hit 7 to go into top view, and 5 to go into orthographic view. I will tab into edit mode, and select everything, and like we did with that plane, I'm just going to hit U, unwrap, project from view. Okay, the sidewalk's a pretty flat piece. I don't have to worry about marking any seams. There is a little bit of a dip here at the corner, but I think it's minor enough that it'll work out just fine. You can also, if you change your top to the UV image editor, and then I'll just hit X to clear out the render result, you can see that it has in fact unwrapped. Okay. All right. As an aside, we're dealing with image textures. I start, especially in this case, I started with the diffuse, is a tileable texture that I found once again at the Creative Commons search. I typed in, I don't remember what it was, it might have been favored texture, something like that, and a search Flickr. You've got all these different options. And then you need to look and figure out what makes a good candidate for an image texture. First thing is you don't want to see any lighting detail in the image. So, you know, stuff that's shot on sunny days, you know, this would not be a good candidate, even though that's obviously not a brick. Actually, let me go back and search for bricks. Might be a little bit more obvious. Okay. A lot of these are actually pretty good. Okay, so something like this, clearly taken on a sunny day, and you've got the lighting data ingrained in the image. Okay, you can tell how that was lit. So if you use this in any scene that is not consistent with that lighting, which I'm going to bet most scenes aren't going to be, it's going to look out of place, and you're just going to be fighting that the whole way. So something taken on a cloudy day without any lighting data is going to be better. So something like this is great. Also, you know, for a brick wall, you want something that is taken straight on. You see some distortion here, shot at angles. These are pretty good. These are good. This is a little skewed. So be mindful of that. This is taking a little bit of an angle, so is this. But they could still be good for reference images, or if you're painting your textures based off of these, they could still work for that. The other thing that's going to be really useful is just large images. You know, the larger the image, the better, which means you're just going to get more detail in your object, the larger your source image is. So that's for diffuse textures or color maps, whatever you want to call them. And then to get the other, in this case the other two, the bump map and the spec map, these were just created in Photoshop. I added a couple of adjustment layers, one to turn it grayscale, and then one just adjusted the levels. With bump maps in general, black is down and white is up. So the darker something is, the more it's going to be pushed down. The lighter something is, the more it's going to be raised up. Spec, black is going to be less reflective and white is going to be more reflective. There are also programs out there that will do that for you. There is, let's see, where is it? Crazy Bump. So Crazy Bump right now is a free beta test for Mac, so it wouldn't be a bad idea to jump on this. For Windows, it's $100. If you buy a professional license, it's $300. But you can use the standard license up until I think it's $200,000 a year is the cap for when you have to buy the professional. So I don't think any of us are in danger of that. But what Crazy Bump can do, and there's various options out there that are either some are free, some are paid for. There's some plugins for GIMP for making what this is. This is a normal map. A normal map is kind of an advanced bump map. Instead of a grayscale image, it's actually using a full color image. And then the RGB data directly translates into the XYZ coordinates, and that's how it determines how the light is affected. In this case, Crazy Bump, you can download the beta. Then when that downloads, very shortly, you can open it up. It's a very simple install on Mac. You just drag it to the applications folder. Just like that, it's installed. I can open it up. It hasn't, there it is. Okay. Open. It's a very simple program. I've got some settings, which I can just set my prefixes for the different types of maps. And then I can open an image. I'll open up a photograph. In this case, I will open up this paver texture we're working with. Okay, it will think. Now, select the shape. So the differences might not be that extreme. They're basically just inverted images. But this, you can see the bricks look like they're being raised up. This looks like they're impressions. So I want the one where they're raised up. And I get this awesome 3D preview of what this normal map will create. So this is just a round sphere with a normal map applied to it from this bump data. And I've got a bunch of different options. I can adjust the intensity. I can sharpen it if I would like. Noise removal. You know, all sorts of different options. And I can generate normal maps this way. This program will also do displacement maps, ambient occlusion, specularity, and just my basic diffusion map. Once I get it where I want it, then I can save it out and use it. So that's how these programs work. They're pretty wonderful. So if you end up doing a lot of this work, not a bad idea to invest in one. Either find one for free that you like that works, or invest in one. There's a couple of decent ones out there for in the $15 to $30 range. But that's how that works. And one way to get textures. Another way would just be Photoshop to get, you know, your diffuse and or your spec and your bump maps. But either way, once you get them, here's how you work with them. So I've got my sidewalk that I did my project from view, from the top view. Okay, and up here in my UV image editor, this is what I get. Here's my sidewalk. It's a bit small, but we'll leave it at that for now, just so we can see the reasons why I adjust it the way that I do coming up. Okay, so now I'm going to change this top view back to my node editor, and I need to add in my images. So I'm going to hit Shift A, add in an image texture, and then I'm going to duplicate my image texture a couple times, and then I will load in my 3 images. So on the top one, I will load in my spec. In the middle one, I'm going to load in my diffuse. And in the bottom one, I will load in my bump map. Okay. And then for my actual material, again, I want to have a diffuse and a glossy surface, and then combine them with a mix shader. So I've already got my diffuse. I will hit Shift A and add in my glossy shader, and then Shift A again and add in my mix shader. And then I will connect everything up so it looks like this. All right, so I've got the kind of skeleton of my nodes set up. At this point, I'm going to, in my 3D view, I'm going to hit slash to go back into global view. And I'm going to hit Shift Z to see my rendered view. I'm just going to zoom in and adjust my my camera so that I get a good view of my sidewalk. Okay. So now let's get our images working. So I'm going to take my diffuse image texture. And one thing you can do to help kind of organize your nodes is in the node editor, if you hit N, it will bring up your node properties. And you've got, up here in the node section, I can change the name. So I will say, I'll call this the color map. And let's see.
That's for diffused?
Yeah. I think it's the label is actually what you need to change. I can call it color map. You can call it diffuse image if you want, whatever makes sense to you. This top one I will call spec map. And if I hover my mouse over what I just typed in, hit Command C, I can hover over the name and hit Command V and paste it in. So now that's spec map, and this third image I will call bump map. Command C and Command V. Okay. Let me turn on my screencast keys again. Okay. All right. So I've got those named. Now I'm going to take my color map, and I'm going to go into the color of both my diffuse and my glossy. Okay. That looks enormously hideous and ugly and not at all like our preview looks. Can anyone guess the reason why? The scale of our UV map, of our UV unwrap, is off. As you can see right here, this is the outline of one brick, which in relation to our scene is, I don't know, maybe 40 feet long. It's an enormous brick and not really the effect we're going for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split my lower view here. And I'm going to change this one to my UV image editor. And I'm going to hit the X down here in the bottom toolbar to clear out my render result. Okay. Then with my sidewalk selected, tab to go back into edit mode and make sure I have everything selected by double tapping A. And I can see my UVs. Right around now is when you can start seeing the value of having a large screen. The one that I have is, I don't know, maybe 20 inches. Not a whole lot, especially when I've got it set up for the projector. But I've got everything selected, and in my 3D view, I'm going to hit Shift Z again to go back into my rendered view, just so I can see the effect of what I'm doing. And now my UV image editor, I've got all my UVs selected. Again, double tap A to make sure that I've got them all selected. And now I'm going to hit S and scale them up. And as I scale them up, you can see the 3D view respond. How about that? Okay. Now I'm still not obviously where I want to be. Just scale up a little bit further. And actually, you know what? At this point, I was going to rotate it, but I don't actually need to because this texture doesn't really matter which way I'm rotated. So it's 0 to go back into the camera view. But I'll just go in my UV view and just keep scaling it up. And again, it doesn't matter that I'm going outside of the bounds of this square right here because I'm using a tileable texture. So it'll just seamlessly tile across. But what I want to do is just kind of figure out what my scale is and how big I want these bricks to be. So if we figure this trash can, let's see, how big is this trash can? The trash can is maybe 2 feet across or so. Okay, so if I look at this, say the average brick is 8 to 10 inches maybe. So I'm just going to keep scaling up my UVs until they're maybe half of the trash can. I don't know, that looks good. That feels alright. And I can adjust that later easily enough. I mean, it really is as simple as selecting the UVs and scaling them. So I'll get close, and then I'll go back to my camera view, and I'll zoom in a little bit so I can see things a little bit better. Then I'm going to collapse my UV editor again because I'm kind of crunched for space right now. You know what? At this point also, I'm going to select my sun lamp, and I'm going to rotate it around so that it's kind of pointing at the camera again. Just so I can see the specular highlights on the bricks a little bit better. Okay, that's better. And I'll adjust my 3D view to get a good look at the bricks. All right, select my sidewalk again, and I got my nodes. So let's go back to these. All right, so let's work on adding some specular highlights to this. Over here in my materials properties, I'm going to change my preview from the sphere to the plane because it's, you know, more accurate to what I'm actually doing. And let's hook up my spec map. So again, I'm using the spec map basically for the values of it. I'm not using the color from it, so I'm going to add in a converter node, RGB to black and white, and I will hook up, I'll zoom in so you can see it, color to color, and then I'm going to add in a math node, converter math, change that to multiply, and then value to the first value, and then the output, I'm actually going to move, I'm going to set the output to, I just noticed something, never mind, to the roughness of my glossy. All right, so instead of going into this glossy shader, I'm actually going to go into the mix shader. So instead of the roughness, I'm going to pull it out of the roughness, I'm going to go into the factor. Okay, so I've got my spec map going into my factor. I'm going to set my glossy roughness. I don't know, we'll go to 0.1 for now, I guess, or maybe 0.2. Oh, and set my multiply value to 1. That's what I was, okay. And then let's set up the bump map as well. So I'm going to take my RGB to black and white and my multiply nodes, select them both by holding down Shift, and hit Shift D to duplicate them and bring them down to the bump map. All right, so I'll hook up my bump map to the RGB to black and white, and then hook up my multiply to my displacement. And then we need to adjust some values. So I'm going to set it to 0.08 worked for me before. Seems to be working well in the preview, 3D view, not so much. Well, actually that looks pretty good. Let's see. Let's try to get our spec a little bit better as well. All right, so let's try to get our spec working a little bit better. Bump up the roughness maybe.
Yeah.
And let's see. Well, all right, so if I'm going to rotate my sun so it's at a little bit more of an extreme angle. Let's go to front view. Okay, that looks good, and then I'll rotate it kind of like that. Okay, so that's the angle of my sun. You can see it really well from this view. Now, I've got the light splashing across my scene. And, oh, I lost my scene. There it is. Okay. That looks better. So it was a combination of my lighting wasn't very good. And And also now I'm in perspective view, which helps a little bit. Okay. So that is how I set up my pavers for my street scene.